some woman on the street. And so there really isn't a lot of evolution in this in this movie, but it's a great example of someone whose model of the world is constrained by the input that it's had. Now, what happens in real life is that when you enter a situation where your model of the world can't handle what's going on around you, that means that the entropy associated with that situation, you're not going to be able to dissipate it. And so your model of the world kind of doesn't make sense anymore, and it begins to go into chaos. Now, what happens is that if that chaos, if that input, whatever it is, continues for long enough, the chaos really begins to build up. And at a certain point, which Prigogine called a bifurcation point, it's like a moment of truth, a moment of peak experience, you might call it. At that moment, the system, whether it's this model of the world we're talking about, or whether it's a seed that's taking in, you know, water and sunlight and all this and trying to germinate, or whether it's a cell in your body that has become too big and it has too much input to it to remain as a single cell and now it has to undergo mitosis and divide, or whether it's a company that has been, like Centerpoint is going through this right now, where we have a certain infrastructure that can handle the business that's coming in, and suddenly business triples, and the infrastructure can't handle it anymore. And so it can't dissipate the entropy, which in this case is sending out the product and handling the phone calls and all that. So we have to reorganize the company at a higher level and create a new, it has to evolve. No matter which of these kinds of situations, systems, it's happening, at a certain point, the system reaches this bifurcation point where it ceases to exist, at least the way it was, as a viable system. The system just falls apart. And what happens then is the most interesting thing of all. Because at that point, there are actually an infinite number of possible outcomes for what might happen next. Now, in Newtonian physics, remember the ball, throwing the ball up in the air? There's really one outcome when you look at that in terms of Newtonian physics. I'm throwing this ball in a certain trajectory at a certain, with a certain force, and there's one outcome. It's going to end up bouncing in a certain place with a certain force. Now, actually, that's also a situation where there are an infinite number of possible outcomes. It's just that one of them has such a high degree of probability that it's pretty much always going to happen. In any situation with a complex system like you reaching this point of truth, this bifurcation point, there is a bell curve of all the possibilities. The ones here in the middle are very high probabilities. The one out here on the edge are very low probability. But we don't know until that moment passes exactly what's going to happen. In other words, evolution of all things is not determined by any kind of certainty. It's determined by probability. So in any given situation, there is a probability of what will happen, but we don't know what it is. Now, one of those infinite number of possible outcomes is that the system will die, that the system will cease to exist as a viable system. But there is another infinite number where it reorganizes itself in some way. And one characteristic that the new system always has is that it can handle the input that the old system could not handle. The new system is always more complex, always more plastic, and always can handle, in some way, the input that the old system could not handle. And it does this by developing an ability to dissipate the entropy that the old system could not dissipate. So you have a situation where you have this system, whatever it is, a seed, a corporation, a highway system, your brain, whatever it is, and it's just going along, bopping along, handling the input, dissipating the entropy, handling the input, dissipating the entropy, which allows it to maintain its structure and the degree of complexity it has. And it's kind of ebbing and flowing with the fluctuations of what happens. But then more comes in than it can handle. It can't dissipate all the entropy. The entropy begins to build up. It becomes more and more and more chaotic until finally it reaches that bifurcation point, that moment of truth where it just falls apart. But right at that instant also, it reorganizes itself at a higher, more complex level that can handle what came before. Let's see if I'm forgetting anything here. So you could say that this is a true death and rebirth of the system. The new system is really new. It's not the old system with something added on. It's really a brand new thing. Now, when we start talking about this in terms of our personal evolution, and using the Centerpoint Holosynth soundtracks, or anything else you might do that would cause evolution, people often think, well, gosh, I don't completely fall apart. I mean, that does happen occasionally with someone, that they really completely fall apart and then reorganize at a higher level. But actually what's happening is that this doesn't have to happen on a macro level. It's happening all the time on little micro levels. And in fact, right now, millions and millions of cells in your body are dividing right now. And each one of those is going through this process because it got to the point where it could not maintain its existence as a single cell in your body. It could not dissipate whatever it needed to dissipate in order to stay as a single cell. And that triggered it to go through this process of reorganizing at a higher level, which is dividing into two cells. And that's happening all the time. Other cells are getting to the point where they can no longer dissipate the entropy they need to dissipate, and for whatever reason, they're not able to reorganize at a higher level, and they're dying. They're ceasing to exist as a viable system. A great example of this that's easy to understand is a highway system. A highway system has a certain number of lanes and a certain number of on-ramps and off-ramps, and the traffic is flowing and everything is just fine, and the people get on and get in the right lane, and when they want to get off, they get in the off-ramp and they go off, and everything just flows smoothly. But if suddenly the amount of traffic increases, if we hold Woodstock 3 or something and everybody comes, and suddenly there are not enough lanes, enough on-ramps, enough what happens? Chaos. The highway system becomes chaotic. Then the highway engineers come along, and this is one of those situations where it doesn't happen just like that because the government's involved. But the highway system, through widening the road, adding more lanes, adding more on-ramps, off-ramps, and so on, reorganizes at a higher level. Now that system, which is a totally new system, it can handle what it couldn't handle before. It can dissipate the entropy that the old system could not dissipate. So before I go on about this, does anybody have any questions about this? Any comments?